The construction site sits in absolute stillness at 3 a.m. There is no wind to stir the dust, no distant hum of traffic to break the quiet. Only the damp, heavy scent of curing concrete hangs in the air, clinging to the wooden frames that skeletonize the darkness. Elias stands at the center of the foundation, his feet planted on the cold, uneven ground. He does not move. He does not speak. He simply watches the way the moonlight traces the jagged edges of the wall. This place is a void of his own making, a space carved out of the night while the rest of the world remains tucked away in sleep. He stares at the concrete, tracing the lines where the moisture pools in the uneven surface. Every inch of this site holds a memory of a night spent in isolation, away from the noise of others. The silence here is not empty. It is dense, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. He shifts his weight, the grit beneath his boots, the only sound in the vast, unlit expanse. He is the only living thing for a mile in any direction. The foundation waits for him, patient and unyielding, reflecting the deep, quiet resolve that has anchored him to this spot for 3 long years. The silence was absolute, until the bag hit the mud. It was a heavy, dull thud followed by the sharp, rhythmic clatter of steel against stone. The sound ricocheted off the wooden frames, vibrating through the quiet air like a warning. Elias did not flinch. He watched the bag settle into the damp earth, its weight dragging the canvas into the mire. He stood for a moment, listening to the echo fade until the site reclaimed its hollow, rhythmic pulse. The sharp metallic bite of the impact lingered in his ears, a stark reminder of the work that remained unfinished. He exhaled, the mist of his breath vanishing instantly into the dark, and reached down to pull the zipper. The metal teeth of the bag groaned as they parted. He gripped the handle of a trowel, feeling the familiar cold bite of the steel against his palm. The weight of the tools was grounding, a familiar pressure that pushed back against the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He did not look back toward the exit. He looked only at the pile of supplies, the raw materials waiting to be transformed. The night was still deep. The period of standing still had ended. Every movement now was calculated, a deliberate step into the labor that defined his existence. Elias knelt on the damp ground. He pressed his fingers into the mortar, feeling the cooling grit under his nails. His skin was mapped with small scars and thick, hardened patches of dead tissue, the inevitable result of 3 years of relentless friction. He ignored the dull ache in his knees and the stiffness in his lower back. He reached for a brick, feeling the rough texture of the clay against his calloused palms. He adjusted his grip, his movements practiced and economical. He applied a thick, even layer of mortar to the wall top, a trowel moving with a steady, sweeping motion that left a clean, uniform bed. He took the brick and pressed it firmly into place. He tapped it twice with the trowel handle, the sound muted and solid. He checked the alignment by eye, then wiped a smear of excess mortar from the edge. His hands were stained gray, the dust ground deep into his pores where soap could no longer reach. He did not pause to admire the progress. He immediately reached for the next brick, his focus locked entirely on the alignment of the row. Each placement was a quiet negotiation between his own endurance and the stubborn weight of the materials. He worked in a rhythm that left no room for hesitation. Elias leaned back, his heels digging into the wet soil. The wall before him was straight, plumb, and solid, a stark contrast to the chaos that existed in his mind 5 years ago. He ran his calloused thumb along the edge of a finished joint, the grit beneath his skin reminding him of the days when he possessed nothing but an idea. Back then, the concept of a load-bearing beam was an alien riddle. He looked at the layout of the foundation, tracing the perimeter with his eyes. He remembered staring at the empty plot, his mind completely blank regarding where to start or how to read a technical drawing. Blueprints were just complex webs of ink on paper that held no meaning to him. He had known nothing of depth, stress, or the physics of gravity pulling at a structure. He had walked through the gate for the first time with no plan, no mentor, and no understanding of the trade. Every corner of this site had once been a mystery that intimidated him. The memory surged forward, pulling him back to that initial, uncertain afternoon when he first realized the sheer scale of what he had promised to build. He stood in the dark, the weight of the past pressing against the reality of the present. The memory of that afternoon remained sharp. He had walked into the hardware store, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and metal polish. Elias stood in the aisle, his eyes scanning rows of tools he did not recognize. His fingers hovered over the display, searching for a trowel. When he finally reached out, his hand shook. He wrapped his fingers around the wooden handle, the weight of it feeling foreign, almost impossible to control. The metal blade seemed far too long for a hand that had never laid a single brick. He felt the eyes of the staff on him, measuring his uncertainty. He looked at the price tag, then at his own empty palms, realizing he was about to trade his savings for a future he could not yet see. His pulse throbbed in his throat. He had gripped the tool so hard his knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to drop it and walk out the door. The store was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, amplifying his isolation. He had walked to the counter with the tool held tight against his side, his breath shallow, his body rigid with the weight of the unknown. That moment was the threshold. He had stepped across it, knowing that once he purchased the trowel, there was no turning back. The memory of the purchase faded, replaced by the cool night air hitting his face. Elias exhaled, the sound thin in the vast quiet of the construction site. He remembered the gatherings he had missed, the nights his friends spent laughing in crowded rooms while he stood here alone. They had heard of his ambition and responded with open amusement. You? Build a house? You would not know the difference between a header and a stretcher, they had joked. The echoes of those voices used to sting, like salt in an open wound. He remembered how their skepticism felt like a physical weight, pulling at his resolve every time he arrived at the foundation. They preferred the easy comfort of the night, the wine, and the social ease. He had chosen the grit of mortar and the ache of his own muscles. He picked up a brick, feeling the rough texture press into his calloused palm. The mockery had been loud once, but it had no place here. He set the brick into place with a sharp, rhythmic tap of his trowel. The laughter of others had long since dissolved into the wind. He was alone, but he was building. The silence was not a void. It was the sound of his own progress, steady and absolute. The echoes of those old voices tried to creep back in, but Elias shut them out with the scrape of his trowel. He scooped a heavy glob of mortar, his wrist snapping with practiced efficiency. He slapped it onto the previous course, the wet slap echoing against the silent foundation walls. Every movement was a direct negation of the doubt they had once cast upon him. When a stone slipped slightly off-center, he did not hesitate. He jammed the edge of his tool into the gap, levered the weight back into position, and held it there until the bond took hold. His forearm muscles corded with the effort, tight and burning. He did not look for applause or validation. He simply reached for the next brick, feeling the rough, heavy clay settle into his palm. He laid it with a deliberate, firm pressure that left no room for error. Each tap of the trowel handle was a declaration. He was not asking for permission to build, and he was certainly not waiting for their approval. He was transforming the space through sheer, repetitive force. The skepticism of others had become nothing more than the dust he wiped from his hands. He stood back, checked the alignment against the moonlight, and reached for the next load of mortar. Elias stepped back, the trowel hanging loose at his side. A passing neighbor might look at this site and see only a structure, a frame of stone and cement rising in the dark. But Elias saw something entirely different. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the hardened ridges of mortar between two stones. This was not just a wall. It was a 5-year timeline frozen in place. He remembered the specific Tuesday during the second year when he had mixed the batch too thin, the mortar running down the side of the foundation like tears. He traced the uneven line of a joint he had finished at midnight, exhausted and doubting his own hands. Every irregularity was a recorded moment of his own evolution. He pushed his thumb against the cured cement, feeling the rock-hard resistance. It was an archive of his persistence. Where others saw a simple building project, he saw the physical manifestation of every hour he had chosen labor over comfort. The mortar was not just a binding agent, it was the solidification of his discipline. He pressed his palm flat against the cool, rough surface, grounding himself in the reality of what he had forged. The past was no longer a series of abstract struggles. It was a permanent, weight-bearing foundation that he had created with his own skin and sweat. The rhythm broke. Elias exhaled, a long, ragged sound that vanished into the cold night air. His knees buckled, just a fraction, as the weight of his own body suddenly felt like a mountain. He dropped his trowel into the bucket. The metallic clatter was sharp, jarring. He leaned heavily against an upright support beam, his chest heaving as he pulled oxygen into lungs that burned. Every muscle fiber in his shoulders felt tight, pulled to the point of snapping. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The concrete floor beneath his boots seemed to tilt. A chair, discarded in the corner, sat in the shadows, a silent invitation to let go, to sit, to end the night early. He looked at the seat, then at his own trembling hands. He did not move toward it. Instead, he gripped the beam, his knuckles white, and forced his spine straight. He dug his heels into the damp earth. Fighting the urge to collapse, he waited for his pulse to slow, for the tremors in his thighs to subside. He was not finished. He stepped away from the support, his legs heavy but moving, and ignored the ache radiating through his lower back. He would not sit. He would not stop. Elias reached down, his fingers closed around a fresh brick, the rough texture biting into his skin. He lifted it, the weight familiar and grounding. He spread a fresh layer of mortar across the foundation, the trowel moving with a newfound deliberate fluidity. The sharp ache in his shoulders began to recede, absorbed into the steady cycle of reach, spread, and set. He placed the brick, tapped it twice to settle it into the bed, and smoothed the excess. The rhythm was hypnotic. One brick, then the next. He was no longer fighting the work, he was moving with it. As he leveled the surface, his gaze drifted past the wall, losing focus on the present. The motion of his hand suddenly mirrored a different movement from a year ago. The sound of the trowel scraping against the stone echoed in his mind, changing pitch. The air grew colder in his memory. He remembered the exact moment his resolve had nearly shattered. He stood there, holding the brick, but his mind was no longer at the construction site. The silence of the night deepened, and the present reality began to blur, pulled back toward a winter that had almost ended everything. The air in the clearing turned biting, the phantom temperature dropping until his breath hitched in his chest. It was January. The sky had been a bruised, heavy gray for days before the sky finally broke. Snow did not fall. It arrived in sheets, thick and relentless, driven by a wind that shrieked through the exposed frame of the house. He saw the site again, not as it was now, but as a graveyard of potential. The white drifts piled against the unfinished walls, swallowing the progress he had fought to make. He remembered watching the snow accumulate on the floorboards, an inch every hour, erasing the lines he had carefully measured. The wind hammered the structure, testing the stability of every joint and beam he had set. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the frame, threatening to buckle the very foundation he stood upon. He looked down at his feet, but instead of the damp earth of the present, he saw frozen slush and ice. The storm was a wall, an insurmountable barrier that turned his labor into a futile struggle against the elements. It was not just cold. It was an active force of erasure, designed to strip away everything he had built. The bank statements had been the final blow. He remembered the paper crinkling in his grip, the numbers showing zero. A hollow void where his security used to be. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the framing, a high-pitched vibration that rattled his teeth. He stood in the center of the site, his hands raw and numb, clutching nothing but the memory of his own ambition. The storm pulled at his balance, pushing him toward the mud. Every gust felt like a demand for him to leave, to quit, to admit that the project was a mistake. He looked at the unfinished walls, now obscured by the swirling white, and felt the structure swaying. The scarcity of his resources pressed against his chest harder than the freezing air. He had nothing left to buy materials, nothing left to feed the progress. The silence that followed each blast of wind was deafening, a vacuum waiting for him to finally give up. He felt the internal structure of his own determination begin to fracture. The resolve that had driven him for years was suddenly thin, brittle, and ready to snap under the relentless pressure of the Arctic air and his own empty accounts. The decision to leave felt like a physical weight lifting off his shoulders. He looked at the unfinished frame one last time, the wood groaning under the pressure of the gale. His legs moved on their own, turning away from the center of the site and heading toward the perimeter fence. Every step was heavy, his boots dragging through the deep, hardening slush. He reached the edge of the property where the gate hung loose on its hinges, clattering against the post with every gust of wind. Beyond the fence, the road stretched out, dark and empty, leading back to a life of certainty and warmth. He looked at his hands, stiff and unresponsive, and realized he no longer had the strength to hold a hammer. The cold had numbed his fingers, and the crushing reality of his situation had hollowed out his motivation. He placed a hand on the gate, the metal biting into his skin. He stood there for a long moment, the world narrowing down to the space between the gate and the path home. He took one step past the boundary, then stopped. The wind lashed against his back, pushing him forward, but his feet refused to move another inch toward the horizon. The wind shifted, slamming into his chest and forcing him to brace his stance. He turned his head, looking back at the pile of lumber buried beneath a fresh layer of drift. He reached down and gripped the handle of the shovel, the metal ice cold against his palm. He did not think. He swung. The first strike hit the frozen slush with a jarring impact that traveled up his arms. He swung again, faster this time, throwing his weight into the blade to peel back the heavy white crust. He worked with a sudden, jagged burst of energy, his breath coming in sharp, visible plumes. He cleared a path, then doubled back to widen the gap. He ignored the burning in his shoulders and the numbness in his feet. He drove the shovel into the ground, lifted, and heaved the ice aside. The rhythmic clatter of metal against wood became the only sound in the storm. He cleared the space around the main beams, then moved to the center of the frame. The shovel bit into the earth repeatedly, carving a clear line through the debris. He was moving now, his body locked into a frantic, relentless pace, stripping away the winter that threatened to bury his work. The sight was emerging, piece by piece, from under the suffocating weight of the snow. The ground lay exposed, damp and uneven. Elias dropped the shovel and knelt, his knees sinking into the slush. He reached for the first floorboard, the wood slick with frost. He aligned the edge, his fingers stiffening, and fumbled for a nail in his pocket. The wind roared, threatening to rip the plank from his grip. He pressed his weight down, pinning the board against the joist. He swung the hammer. The first strike missed, glancing off the wood. He reset his stance, shifted his weight to shield the work from the gale, and swung again. This time, the nail bit true. He hammered with a steady, relentless cadence, the metallic ringing cutting through the howl of the storm. He grabbed the next board, slotted it into place, and drove it home. He did not look at the sky. He did not look at the road. He looked only at the gap between the boards, closing it, one strike at a time. The wood groaned under his force, but it held. He crawled forward, laying board after board, creating a solid surface where there had been only uncertainty. His hands were raw, his movements mechanical, but he did not stop until the platform was sealed. He stood up, his legs trembling, and stamped his feet on the new floor. It did not shift. It was solid. Elias stood still, the silence of the site returning to fill the space where the wind had been. He looked down at his palms. The skin was thick, mapped with deep ridges and stained with the gray, permanent grit of mortar. He pressed his fingers together, feeling the stiffness of muscles that had learned the exact tension required to hold a brick steady. He shifted his gaze to the wall, rising before him. It was plumb. It was level. He remembered the hardware store, the shaking in his fingers when he bought that first trowel, and the weight of the blueprints he could not read. He had been a novice then, a man defined by what he did not know. He reached out and traced the edge of a brick, the surface cool and rough against his skin. This wall was not just stone and mortar. It was the physical record of every mistake he had corrected and every cold night he had endured. He was not that trembling man anymore. He gripped the edge of the frame, his knuckles white, and felt the structure hold firm beneath his touch. He was solid. The wall was solid. The transformation was not in the finished house, but in the hands that had built it. The doubt that once paralyzed him had vanished, left behind like discarded scaffolding. He reached for a fresh brick, his fingers finding the familiar balance point without a second thought. He placed it, but the alignment was off by a fraction of an inch. A year ago, he would have panicked, torn the entire section down, and lost an hour to indecision. Now, his hands moved with a different intent. He tapped the brick once, twice, the mortar yielding to the precise amount of pressure he applied. It clicked into place, perfectly plumb. He felt the change in his own rhythm. His movements were no longer tentative or slow. He reached for the trowel, scooped a measured amount of mortar, and spread it across the base with a single, sweeping arc. Every action was cleaner, faster, and more efficient than the last. He worked with a fluidity that made the heavy materials seem weightless. He was no longer fighting the structure, he was guiding it. He picked up another brick, his pulse steady, his eyes scanning the wall for the next gap. The hesitation that had once defined his nights was gone, replaced by the relentless, driving cadence of progress. He was sharper, more resilient, and perfectly attuned to the work beneath his hands. The rhythm held. He reached for the final brick, his fingers calloused and steady, feeling the rough texture of the fired clay. He spread a final, thin layer of mortar across the gap, the trowel leaving a clean, sharp edge. He lowered the brick into place, pressing down with calculated pressure until it sat perfectly flush with the course below. There was no vibration, no movement, just the solid resistance of a finished join. He tapped the side once with the handle of his tool, the sound sharp and final in the thin morning air. He drew his hand away and let the trowel rest against the bucket. The adrenaline that had propelled his hands through the last hour began to recede, replaced by the heavy, satisfying ache in his shoulders. He lifted his forearm, wiping a smear of dust and gray mortar from his forehead. He did not look for a witness. He did not look for approval. He simply stared at the line of masonry, the edge of the wall now reaching the mark he had set for the night. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cooling air, and stood perfectly still. The wall was no longer just a project. It was a physical manifestation of his own endurance, standing firm against the encroaching dawn. A sliver of light breached the horizon, thin and sharp as a blade. It crawled over the edge of the foundation, pushing back the deep blue of the night. Long, distorted shadows stretched away from the wall, tracing the uneven lines of his work. Elias watched the sun climb. It did not warm the air yet, but it changed the texture of everything it touched. He looked down at his palms, the skin cracked and stained, and saw the map of his own persistence etched into his flesh. He had started this as a novice, trembling at the weight of a trowel, but the person who stood here now felt entirely different. The wall was not just a collection of bricks and mortar. It was a record of every cold morning and every moment of doubt he had pushed through. He realized then that the house was merely a byproduct. The real structure was the discipline he had forged within himself. His muscles thrummed with a dull, familiar ache, but his mind felt clear, stripped of the static that had once clouded his ambition. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the light was deepening into a rich, golden hue. He did not need a finish line to justify the effort. The process had dismantled his hesitation and rebuilt his resolve, layer by layer, until the man who remained was capable of anything. Elias knelt and began the familiar routine of tidying the site. He scraped the excess mortar from his trowel, the steel ringing softly against the stone. He placed the tool into the heavy canvas bag, the metal clinking as it settled against the handle of his hammer. He stood up, his joints stiff, and scanned the progress one last time. Every line was straight, every bond was locked. He picked up the bag, the weight familiar and grounding against his shoulder. He turned his back on the foundation and walked toward the edge of the property. The morning light caught his face, bright and unfiltered now that he had cleared the tree line. He took a long, steady breath, the air crisp and clean in his lungs. He did not look back. The foundation was a finished chapter, a solid base for whatever followed next. He stepped onto the main path, his stride rhythmic and purposeful. His hands were empty of tools, yet he felt the strength of the last 5 years in every movement he made. He walked into the expanding warmth of the morning, his mind already mapping the next layer of the journey. The structure remained, but he was already moving forward, ready for the work that lay beyond the horizon.